Oh boy. When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory.
So finally, we get to talk about some music here. Let's look at this Chopin Prelude in C major. Hopefully you've already clicked the link from your syllabus and gone online and have the score where you can review it. So let's give it a listen, shall we? So you might have had two observations about that piece. One, it's really short, and two, that's a whole lot of notes. But what's this class for if not looking at pieces that have a whole lot of notes in them? And since this one's really short, maybe we can get to some good conclusions about what those whole lot of notes are doing. So let's get started. Here's the score. One thing you'll notice is that, well, it's a whole lot of notes, it's also a whole lot of repetition. Until we get to the very, very ending of the piece, almost every measure looks identical rhythmically to the measure before it. So that's actually a good thing. That means that, really we don't have to unscramble a lot of different rhythmic information. Most of what we're looking for with a piece like this is we're looking at harmonic ideas and melodic ideas. So let's listen to it again with the score on display this time. Here we go. Things we don't have to worry about with this piece are what form is it. I will tell you all up front, this piece is not binary form, it's not ternary form, it's not sonata or variation or any sort of form we can label per se. It's what some people call a unipartite form or a one-part form or whatever. But this piece doesn't really have a form it adheres to, other than just it sets forth a pattern and keeps developing and repeating that pattern, which is the way a lot of preludes work. More on that later. So, one thing we should want to know about this piece is how does it communicate with us harmonically and melodically? Well, we know it's in C major from Chopin's title, Prelude Number 1 in C major. So we should analyze it in C major. And if you look at the measures, you'll notice that there's a fair amount of arpeggio work going on in the measures. A lot of times when we see big leaps in music, that means that what we're seeing is we're seeing chord outlines through arpeggios, and that's the case here. So if you start looking, you'll realize that every measure basically is telling us a different chord, which we might want to understand in the key of C major. And what that little staff I just popped in there for you to look at is doing is it's reducing this down to where it's a little bit easier to see. It's taking out the complicated triplet rhythms. It's taking out sometimes when there are voices that are duplicated in different octaves. And the other thing it's doing is it's showing you the non-chord tones. If something's written as a grace note, I'm interpreting it as a non-chord tone in this piece. So that little rogue A at the beginning of the first measure, it messes up our C-E-G harmony by being a non-chord tone. And the type of non-chord tone it is, once you reduce this down, you realize it's just a neighbor tone. It gets between the C that's the highest note of the C-E-G chord in measure 1 and the G that's the highest note of the G-B-D-F chord in measure 2. So once you've got those non-chord tones singled out, you can go through and figure out what Roman numerals go there. And if you want to pause this, you can go ahead and figure out the chords for yourself. It might be good exercise. So if you're going to pause, pause now. Because if you didn't pause, I'm going to click it and show you the chords. Here are what the chords are for that first little phrase right there. And you look at them and you realize there's nothing really scary going on with any of those chords. They're just basically a normal bunch of chords. Almost all of them fit in the key of C major. The one exception we have is there's that secondary dominant at the end of the line when the F sharp shows up. But other than that, this is a fairly sensible chord progression in the key of C. 1, 5, 1, first inversion 1, 2 chord, which is a predominant, 5, 6, 5, a 5 chord, which is also a predominant. So you can probably figure out what the next chord's maybe going to be. Next chord's going to be a 5 chord, because that's where 2 chords and 5 of 5 chords tend to go. It's a 5-7 chord, and then it leads us from measure 8 to measure 9 to a cadence of harmonic sorts where we have 5-7 going to 1. And that's sort of our first little phrase in the piece, is those first 8 measures. And then from there on, again, we're just dealing with a bunch of fairly normal chord types and non-chord tones stuck at the ends of the measures. But you've got a 1 chord and a 5 chord that goes to a 1 and a first inversion 1 and another 2, 6, 5. It's almost like Chopin is repeating the piece. He's going through the same chords he was just going through. But when we get to the third system, things are going to be a little bit different. That 2 chord didn't go to a 5 of 5 chord or anything. That 2 chord went to a secondary dominant that was a 5, 4, 3 of 4. And from there, the piece sort of goes in a little bit of a different way. But if you look at what's going on, you can see that Chopin's still holding fast to that little pattern he was doing of basically arpeggios with one non-chord tone in the highest register. And that non-chord tone can be expressed as a passing tone or a chromatic appoggiatura sometimes, or an escape tone, or neighbor tone, whatever he wants to do with it. But those are our chords for the second, or for the next system there, right? We've got a secondary dominant, which is 5, 4, 3 of 4. And remember, anytime you see an accidental that's not part of the key signature, like that B flat here, and that's one of the chord tones, remember that you've got to analyze that chord as something that's not just a straight up Roman numeral like 1, 2, 3, 4 or whatever, but it's going to be a secondary dominant or a chromatic chord like a Neapolitan or an augmented 6th chord or something like that. But all the other chords in this line are still diatonic in the key of C major. We haven't even really had to modulate in this piece yet. You can get through that whole line by just following things through the way they are there. And again, there's a little bit of a simplified staff. And you notice what Chopin's been doing is just kind of moving up. That bass line was going up by steps. It skips down from the E to the F sharp just so it can have a little bit more oomph to it from measure 21 to 22. But what he started back around measure 14, he's continuing that kind of dramatic climb in the bass line. Measure 22, we get another nice chromatic chord there. We get a chord that we could interpret a couple different ways. I've got it analyzed as 7 diminished 6/5 of 5. Although if you look at how it's spelled, that's not how Chopin is spelling the chord. Chopin is spelling it like a D sharp, F sharp, A, C chord. And a 7 diminished 6/5 of 5 chord in this key would be an F sharp A C E flat chord. So Chopin's got the chord spelled wrong, so to speak. It should be E flat instead of D sharp. But I'm calling it 7 diminished 6/5 of 5 because we've got all the right notes in it. And if you look at the chords it goes to, the 1-6-4 going to 5-7, cadential 6-4 to 5-7, that all means that that chord before it would make good sense functionally as a 7 diminished 6/5 of 5 chord. That being said, there's another way we could analyze this. Like I say, one thing you can do is analyze that chord inharmonically, that's what the EH stands for, by the way, as an F sharp A C E flat 7 diminished 7 of 5 chord that goes to 1-6-4 and then 5, which is a fine thing. The other thing you could analyze that chord as, though, is as a common tone diminished 7th chord, or what we call an embellishing diminished 7th chord. Some people just label them CT diminished 7 or EMB diminished 7 or whatever. Or some people actually label them with modified Roman numerals. They would call this one sharp 2 diminished 6/5 because the root of the chord is the sharp second scale degree, the D sharp. And then you can see it's a D sharp, F sharp, A, C chord in first inversion. I like CT diminished 6/5 better for these things than putting on the numbers, but you'll see people who analyze with numbers like sharp 2 or sharp 4 or sharp 6 diminished 7. They're talking about the same type of chord when they do that. And really, either analysis is fine. If you say it's a CT diminished 6/5 chord, you need to be able to find your CT, your common tone. Well, the common tone is this. It's the middle C that's at the top of the bass staff in measure 22. And if you look, it's held over to the 1-6-4 chord in measure 23. There's that middle C. That's our common tone. If you analyze it as a 7 diminished 7 of 5 chord, that's fine too, because going to 1-6-4 is the same as going to 5. Cadential 6-4 is basically a 5 chord. So both of those analyses work and remind us of something that we hopefully knew before this class, but we're definitely going to be reminded of time and again in this class, which is that a lot of times there's more than one interpretation you can make for something and still be analyzing the piece correctly. And this is one of those small instances of that. It doesn't matter if you hear it as a secondary diminished 7th chord, or it doesn't matter if you hear it as an embellishing diminished 7th chord. They both still lead to the same outcome, which is that we're having yet another cadence coming up here because measure 23 and 24 give us dominant harmony, and we have an authentic cadence when we go to that root position 1 chord in measure 25. And after we go to that 1 chord in measure, I guess it's 25, the piece is basically going to be in a concluding phase from there on out because there's a low C pedal tone that's present in every measure, and all the chords are chords that just sort of keep us anchored to the 1 chord. It's either a 1 chord or it's a 5-7 chord over a C pedal, and that keeps us very geared around 1. So from this point on, it sounds like the piece is at its concluding section. And you can see that being the case here in the last system as well, where the piece just stays centered around the tonic with that tonic pedal in the lowest voice, and all the chords tend to reinforce tonic harmony. There's some little suggestions of an F chord over a C bass in the last 3 or 4 measures of the piece there. I've got them analyzed as little appoggiatura tones though. But, basically we've hit our final 1 chord and the piece is concluding. So let's listen to the piece again, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. Now let's think about something else with this piece. Let's think about its form. And I know I said it doesn't have a form earlier, but I mean it doesn't have a capital F form. We can't say it's a rondo or a passacaglia or anything like that, but nothing that works musically really gets by being formless, and this piece is no exception. This piece basically, even as short as it is, tends to have three rather discrete sections. There's the first section that this blue is showing you, where what Chopin does is he really sets up the key of C major, lets us know we're in C, and takes us to that cadence that happens in the third measure of the second line. That third measure of the second line is the start of a second section that I'm marking in red. That's the section that's most turbulent in the piece. It tends to have more chromatic chords. The music tends to be more restless, tends to be moving up, up, up in register and building excitement, and getting us finally to the last section of the piece. After the red section, we've got that 1, 6, 4, 5, 7 that in the red section. They cadence on a 1 chord at the ending of this green section. And that green section is the final part where there's that C pedal tone that keeps the piece sort of anchored on its tonic and ends the piece. So basically, even though I can't say this is a sonata form or this is binary or anything like that, we can still say the form of this piece is it has the opening introductory section, which is in blue there, where Chopin establishes the tonic chord and creates a cadence on 1. And then it has that red section where Chopin creates more turbulence, the middle section. And then it's got the concluding section where we come back to the tonic harmony and the piece ends. If I was looking for things to describe these sections, I might call the opening section the establishment, where the key is established. Then that red section is the development, and that concluding section where we come back to the tonic, we could call the termination. Now, let's ask some deeper questions about this piece. Not necessarily theory questions, but musicological questions in the bigger sense. My big musicological question is, why did Chopin decide to write a prelude in C major anyway? What was poking him to do this? And the answer is that, in addition to just writing a lot of great piano music, Chopin was sort of responding to the heritage and history of keyboard music that was so influential on musicians at that time and this time. The guy who prodded Chopin into doing this is Johann Sebastian Bach, who wrote his collection of preludes and fugues in the Well-Tempered Claviers, Volume 1 and 2. And as y'all may remember from music history class, the idea Bach had at this time in history when people are trying to experiment with having new keys to writing in keys they wouldn't have written in 1624, like maybe writing in the key of F sharp major or E flat minor. Bach decides in 1724 that he's going to write these pieces that are in all those far out keys. So he writes Well-Tempered Clavier Volume 1 in 1724. Volume 2 comes out in 1748, I believe. And both of those volumes presented us with a prelude and a fugue in all possible major and minor keys. So in the first half of the 19th century, when Chopin goes to write his preludes, he's modeling them on Bach. And just like Bach, Chopin creates a series of 24 preludes, no fugues, but they're in all the major and minor keys. They get through them a little bit differently. When Bach does his preludes and fugues, he takes a parallel key approach. First preludes in C major, second preludes in C minor, and then he goes up by half steps. Prelude 3 is in C sharp, Prelude 4 is in C sharp minor, and he's just going to go up, from there, D, E flat, E, F, F sharp, etc., ending up in the key of B minor. Chopin goes through his keys differently, but he goes through all the major and minor keys just like Bach. And just like Bach, his first prelude is in C major, but then Chopin's going to go with a relative key design. His second one's going to be in A minor, and that exhausts all the no sharps and flats keys. And then he's going to go around the circle of fifths. And his third prelude will be 1 sharp in the key signature major, G. His fourth prelude will be 1 sharp in the key signature minor, E minor. So the fifth prelude by Chopin is going to be in D, the sixth is going to be in B minor, etc. And we're going to work our way around the circle. But Chopin is writing with an eye toward history before him and trying to emulate Bach by writing a collection of preludes in all the major and minor keys. And it doesn't stop there. I would contend that there are deeper similarities between some of Chopin's and Bach's preludes than merely just the idea of trying to be in all the possible major and minor keys. And what you're looking at now is the beginning of the very well-known Bach C major prelude. Just like the Chopin C major prelude, the Bach C major prelude is basically just a bunch of arpeggios. It's a pattern that goes on throughout the piece. Just like Chopin's prelude is basically the same arpeggio pattern throughout the piece. Just like the Chopin piece, the Bach piece isn't written in any particular stylized form like binary or ternary, but the Bach piece has its own form. And in fact, the form of the Bach piece is remarkably similar to the form of the Chopin piece. Here's the Chopin prelude again. Remember, it has that red-green, or that blue-red-green form of establishment, development, and termination. Here's the form of the Bach piece now. Just like Chopin, there's that opening section in blue where Bach uses his first 4 measures to establish his key of C major. Then there's that red section where Bach continues repeating, goes through a lot of chromaticism and some modulation, and a period of instability, which we're calling the development. And then ultimately we get to that green section where you have the tonic being restored with a tonic pedal, no less, and where we basically stay rooted around tonic harmony for our conclusion. The proportions are different in Bach. It's a much longer development section compared to the establishing section and terminating section, but form is not proportion. Form is process. And the process Bach uses to write his piece is the same process that Chopin's going to employ in his prelude in the same key of C major. Fascinating stuff, huh? And the great news is these Chopin preludes have so much more to offer us and so much more to tell us as well. So I want to look at a couple other ones, and they're going to be your first assignments. It's the prelude in E minor and the prelude in A minor. The prelude in E minor is a very well-known prelude by Chopin, probably one of his most well-known compositions. And the prelude in A minor is just nuts. I'm putting worksheets for both of them for y'all to do and hand in. I would suggest doing the E minor first. It is, comparatively speaking, the easier of the two. Both these worksheets are due by 4:30, i.e. the beginning of class time on Tuesday. The video that will happen on Tuesday will be a series of videos, one on the E minor prelude and one on the A minor prelude. So the reason you need to turn these in before 4:30 is so that the work I'm going to be looking at is your own thoughts on these pieces. Then I'm going to actually have a couple videos up to take you through these two preludes and talk about what's going on in them, like we would do if we were meeting in person in class. That video will be available beginning at 4:30 on Tuesday, January 12th. But get your homework in on these pieces first. I don't expect you to have everything perfect and right on this homework assignment. I'm more interested in seeing your answers than in knowing your answers are correct answers. And I will grade leniently. So turn the darn thing in. That's important. The worksheets for these assignments are in the modules on Canvas, and they are in the January 11 module. The videos explaining these two pieces will be accessible in the January 12 module, as well as any other homework that might be due for upcoming assignments. So, go do that and enjoy yourselves.